When you have to start doing something, you've probably said this: "I'm just not in the mood." That sentence sounds completely normal, to the point that you see it as a reasonable excuse to wait. You think, if you wait a little longer, that mood will eventually come. And when it does, getting started will feel easier. The problem is, the longer you wait for the mood to come, the less likely you are to actually start. What's even stranger is, have you ever noticed that the mood often shows up only after you start doing something? If that's true, why do you still feel like you have to wait for the mood before you do anything? So, what is it that's actually keeping your brain waiting? And why is it that the longer you wait for the mood, the harder it feels to get started? To understand why you keep waiting for the mood, you have to look at what's actually happening every time you say, "I'm just not in the mood." Most people think the problem is simple. They think the mood just hasn't come yet, so they choose to wait. The problem is, that explanation doesn't really explain what's happening. If the reason really was that the mood hadn't come yet, you should never have days when you suddenly feel motivated to do something. But that's not what actually happens. The mood does come. Sometimes for no clear reason, sometimes after listening to a song, sometimes after seeing something inspiring. And what's even stranger, sometimes it doesn't show up until after you start working on the very thing you wanted to put off. Which means, the problem isn't that the mood never shows up. So why do you keep waiting? Think about it. When you say, "I'm just not in the mood," putting it off feels like the right decision, because to your brain, waiting really does feel like the most reasonable choice. In your mind, starting without the mood feels like a bad idea. But things don't usually work that way. You think, maybe later. Once the mood comes, it'll be easier. The problem is, what usually ends up happening? You wait today, tomorrow. You tell yourself, "I'm just not in the mood." The day after, it's the same excuse. Until eventually, you only do it when you can't put it off anymore. If you really think about it, how many times has waiting actually made it easier for you to start? The answer is probably far less often than you've always imagined. But strangely enough, even after going through the same thing over and over again, you still repeat the pattern. You still believe that maybe this time the mood will come. And maybe that's where the real problem lies. If waiting so often doesn't work, why does your brain still feel like it's the right choice? The answer lies in one assumption your brain quietly believes. Your brain believes that in just a little while, everything will feel easier. Every time you say, "I'm just not in the mood," your brain is actually hoping that if you wait just a little longer, getting started will feel easier. That heavy feeling will fade, and the task won't feel as difficult as it does right now. When you think about it, that kind of hope actually sounds reasonable. If there's a chance that everything will feel easier in a few hours or tomorrow, why force yourself to do it now? The problem is, that hope rarely comes true. More often than not, the opposite happens. The longer you wait, the bigger the task starts to feel. The more often it shows up in your mind, the more it bothers you. And every time you think about it, the feeling doesn't get lighter, it gets heavier. As a result, your desire to start doesn't get stronger, it gets weaker. Without even realizing it, you keep hoping that in just a little while everything will feel easier. But the longer you wait, the harder it feels to start. If that's the case, why does that uncomfortable feeling often start to fade after you begin working on the task? This is where the biggest misunderstanding lies. All this time, you thought what you were waiting for was the mood. But pay close attention. What usually happens when you actually start working on the task? What changes? The task is still the same. You're still the same person. The mood might not have even changed. But why doesn't it feel as hard as you imagined? Because what actually changes isn't the task. It's the way your brain experiences it. And this is where most people get it wrong. What you're really waiting for isn't the mood. It's the discomfort before getting started to disappear. The problem is that discomfort rarely goes away just because you wait. Instead, it starts to fade after you take the first step. Which means the problem was never that you weren't in the mood. The problem is your brain trusts the feeling too much that comes up before you start. If the problem isn't your mood, then what do you actually need to change to start without waiting for the mood to come? When you say, "I'm just not in the mood," what do you think you're actually waiting for? Leave your answer in the comments. It turns out, the thing that needed to change all along wasn't your mood. What you need to change is the order. All this time, you may have believed it worked like this. The mood comes first, then you start. But your brain usually works the other way around. You start, then your feelings gradually begin to change. This isn't just an opinion. In psychology, there's an approach called behavioral activation. This approach is used to help people who struggle to take action because they keep waiting to feel more ready. The principle is simple. Don't wait for your feelings to change. Take action, because taking action itself is often what changes your feelings. Imagine this. A car stopped on a hill. The hardest part isn't when it's already moving. It's the moment the wheels first start to turn. Once the car is moving, keeping it going takes much less effort. Your brain works the same way. The hardest part isn't doing the task, it's taking the first step. And because you've had the order backwards all this time, you keep believing you have to feel ready before you can start. But that feeling of being ready often doesn't come until after you start moving. If that's true, How do you get your brain to take that first step without waiting for the mood to come? It turns out, your brain doesn't need to be convinced to finish the whole task. It just needs to be convinced to take the first step. Because before you start, your brain can only imagine how hard the task will be. Everything in your mind is still just an assumption. This is going to be exhausting. This is going to take forever. This is going to be hard. The problem is, your brain is much more likely to fear something it only imagines than something it's actually experiencing. Imagine this. You're standing at the edge of a swimming pool. Before your feet touch the water, you keep imagining how cold it's going to be. But the moment you actually get in, those thoughts stop. Now, your brain isn't guessing anymore. It's dealing with reality. The same thing happens when you're about to start something. Before you start, your brain is busy imagining how hard it's going to be. But once you take that first step, your brain stops imagining and starts focusing on what actually needs to be done. That's why the first step almost always feels the hardest. Not because the task is the hardest, but because before you move, your brain only has an idea of what it's like, not the experience. So, when you're not in the mood, don't wait for your feelings to change. Instead, take that first step. If you look at everything we've talked about, the problem isn't that you don't have the mood, and it isn't that you can't get started either. What's really happening is, your brain sees discomfort as a signal to wait. But mood isn't a requirement to start. Mood often comes after you start. If you want to understand yourself on a deeper level, subscribe, because in the next video, we're going to uncover something you may have never realized. See you in the next video.